Welcome, everyone, to today's session on making co-funding work. My name is Busayo Mishotide, and I'm delighted that to see everyone here. As many of you know, this session comes at a very important moment for the AERFC in our collective work that we do around African education funding and research. So across the continent and globally, we are seeing a growing momentum around collaborative funding as a means to tackle complex and systemic challenges. And this also include the planning around the Enhancing Education Research in Africa, the ERA initiative that the Secretariat member, the AERFC members are thinking of collaborating on. But yet, there are challenges and opportunities around these co-funding activities. So today we have two exceptional panelists, Julie Lafrance from IDRC and Andrea Ordoñez from Southern Voice. Both of them will be bringing in deep experience and critical insights into these questions. We have some guiding questions prepared. So we'll be exploring models that have worked, challenges, opportunities around this, and how we as a group can better collaborate in support of African-led solution. But before we invite Julie and Andrea, I would like to also encourage us to engage as much as possible, ask questions, and also bring in your own experience. We want to make this as collaborative as possible. I will now hand over to my colleague Joy, who will be moderating this session. Joy.
Thank you, Busayomi, and good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being part of this very important discussion. So I work with Busayomi and Rachel on AERFC, which is a very useful and valued space. So as Busayomi said, we are here today to talk about co-funding, and we are really going to talk about how to move from goals to actions and what are the practicalities, which is why the experience and the expertise of our panelists is so important. We are very lucky to have perspectives from both sides of the co-funding equation. So both the funder side, thanks to Julie, and then the recipient side from Andrea, who will reflect on the realities of the recipient sides. So now, having said that, I will move on to our core discussion, and I will open up the first question to both of our panelists, where we talk about operational challenges. So Julie and Andrea, if you will very kindly reflect on what are some of the key barriers and real world challenges which you think funders make in making co-funding work, and what are maybe some challenges that you have encountered personally in these sort of partnerships, and how were they addressed? So yes, I would love to hear perspectives on that, and I will open up the discussion to Julie and Andrea.
Great. Thanks so much for that welcome, and really excited to be here for this conversation. So my name is Julie Lafrance. I currently work for the International Development Research Center in the Strategy Evaluation and Learning team. But today I'm going to be sharing my experiences from almost a decade working with the Think Tank Initiative, which was a 10-year program of support that provided core flexible funding to 52 policy research organizations in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. So just to kick us off, from an operational challenges perspective, the Think Tank Initiative had 4 and 5 funders during the 2 phases of its programming. And for me, having been at the table for these discussions, I mean, right from the start, really finding alignment with other funders' priorities, particularly bringing together philanthropy and bilateral donors, their incentives, their drivers for setting their strategic direction very much differ. And so trying to find that common priority setting in terms of the programming and really agreeing on timelines that make sense is one very upfront challenge. Oftentimes with these co-funding initiatives, the results frameworks are put together in a co-created manner, usually with one or two funders taking the initiative, but then bringing in those perspectives and trying to get to a point where the results framework really reflects the values and impact sort of objectives of the different funders. For me, that's a big challenge. I think in most co-funding situations, the Think Tank Initiative was one, but obviously there's many others. The Science Granting Council Initiative, another huge co-funding program. I mean, the list goes on. But there, what I feel is still missing, even though funders have been able to come together to come to some common understanding and common agreement and some consensus around that priorities and then that desire for sort of measurement and results is still the voice of those stakeholders and actors who should be sitting around the table to design these co-funding initiatives. Those are, the very stakeholders that these efforts are often aiming to benefit. And so I think that's still a huge obstacle for funders that are designing co-funding initiatives. I mean, at the funder table, there's always governance challenges and power imbalances. And largely, I think that amongst donors, those have been more or less overcome. A lot of it has to do with how much skin in the game you have as an investor, as a funder. There's all that, money is power. And so finding that sweet spot and being able to really navigate those negotiations amongst funders is great. And I think we've come a long way. But again, coming back to if the voices and perspectives of the very constituents that the programs are aiming to be the users, to be the ones, whether it's government or civil society or, farmer cooperatives, depending on, whatever the focus of the programming is, having those stakeholders at the table and really addressing that and bringing that into how a co-funded program or initiative is governed is another challenge that I think we see in front of us. Maybe I'll end with one last one. I think a lot of it has to do with the risk appetite of different funders and different funders, level of comfort and willingness to really invest in maybe unproven or higher risk initiatives and how they really see their risk threshold and appetite and what constraints they're under. Obviously, bilateral donors, especially in a climate like we're in right now, have very, very high political constraints, resource constraints, and even, philanthropy by and large has tended to be more risk tolerant, but even we're seeing a bit of an entrenchment of that risk tolerance as well. So I think for funders in particular, being able to really test and push the limits of their risk appetite and be able to innovate or find creative ways to kind of make their dollars count, but allow that risk appetite, because I think by really addressing the risk perceptions, that's where we're going to be able to be a lot more inclusive about our grant making and really reach some of the groups that don't tend to get the grants. Sadly, it's oftentimes the same organizations, the same researchers that end up getting repeat grants, and our ability to really reach and diversify our grant making to new players is something that I think is still a big challenge.
Thank you for that, Julie. And I think your ending really sort of segues into what could possibly be Andrea's perspective on this especially from the recipient side. So you spoke about how differing risk appetites can form challenges and how there are power imbalances and governance challenges and various sort of restraints. So I'm sure that all of these translate into specific sets of challenges for someone like you, Andrea. And I'm curious to hear that what you perceive as some of the biggest challenges and this sort of a mechanism being from the recipient side.
Great, thank you, Joy, and thank you for the invitation to come today. Just to reiterate that my comments will come from the experience of working on the think tank space, first as a recipient at the local level at the national level in Ecuador, where I live, where I am from, and then through Southern Voice, that is a network of over 70 think tanks across the global south, and where I have finished my term as executive director. What I would like to reflect is that I think that it's very important for any sort of donor collaborative to have a very clear sense of what the objective is, and then to identify if collaborative funding is the right approach to achieving those goals. So understanding really why the collaborative is there, and why is it better than independent funding, because it brings in costs, and every cost that you are investing in collaborating is money that's not going to the grantees, right? So you should really make sure that it is worth it. And the other reason is because I think that the collaboratives have can have very different models depending on the objective. So it's difficult to say, is this model good? Is this model bad? It depends on what is the final objective of that collaboration, right? So setting up something for investing in developing a vaccine is probably very different from localizing resources into getting into more local-based or national-based organizations. These are very different tasks, and they would probably need a very different approaches to be solved. So I think that would be my first point. The other one, and as Busayomi was mentioning, there is this assumption at the beginning that bringing funders together drives collective action. But I think we have to also be critical of that question and say, whose collective action we want to promote. Is it that the most critical collective action is that of donors, or do we want to promote collective action within the actors in the system that we're trying to work with, right? And that may again take you to different sorts of models, and I'll go into this a little bit more in detail, but it is very different if our objective is collective action by the donors and just coordinating them, or if the objective is broader and actually the collective action that we want to promote is of those actors, of the grantees, of those doing the actual work. Then the other issue that I would like to highlight is the power dynamics, and Julie has made a reference to this internally among the funders, but I would like to take this externally. And funders, by their nature, have a lot of power in the system, and they need to think really of how to manage it. And I think that the potential pitfall of collaborative funding is that depending on the scale and the focus, it could become like an economic cartel, right? Like a cartel in the economic sense, that a group of donors gather too much power on a sector or on an issue, right? So in economics, that's when companies get together and try to get too much power, and then they can, by their actions, they shift the entire market, right? And that can happen in the funder sector as well, right? If you have most of the money coordinated in a certain way with a certain agenda, there is less possibility of new things coming up or other ideas emerging, because there's just too much power of a given group setting the agenda. So while collaboration can be good as a grantee, I've also seen it as a limitation because you don't see an opportunity to pitch in a new idea or bring in something different because everybody's aligned with just one predefined agenda. And so these are just like some ideas that I think are important to bring up, and that may even become more relevant when we're talking about just funding at the local level, because sometimes we may think, as a relatively smaller investment or program, of 10, 20 million, you may say, well, that's not that big of an investment for a group of funders, but maybe at the local level, it's a lot of money. And then you kind of you can distort how that sector or things in that in that context work. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts, Joy.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think this is very useful, and especially for funders, those who are in this room and those who are not, because what you said, overall, what you said was that keep the needs and the views of the end recipients and the end users in mind, right? So that whose work, that make sure that their voices are represented, and we are mindful of their collective action, and so that they also continue to have a voice at the table. And also, yeah, just in the midst of co-funding, don't lose sight of the bigger picture, that how much power funders as individuals have, and how to be mindful not to distort the dynamics and respond to the real needs on the ground, that make sure that it's not only the most sexy ideas or the most prominent ideas that are being promoted. So I think all of those are very useful nuggets for this group and also other funders as we look to design co-funding groups and mechanisms. I will also encourage participants to leave any questions in the chat. Yeah, but those have, and also if I'll move on to the next part, but if where we talk about governance and accountability, and this came up that both of you referred to this in your comments. So maybe if you can just draw from some experiences and speak a bit about how can multiple funders navigate joint accountability? Because as you both pointed out, that there are multiple power dynamics at play, there may be multiple interests at play. So how in such a situation can one navigate accountability, and how will this be affected in practice? That what kinds of mechanisms and structures will help ensure that accountability is maintained? And while our speakers reflect on these questions, I will encourage participants to leave questions in the chat box, and I can pass them on to our speakers. So yes, Julie and Andrea will. Julie, maybe you want to go first. That how can, just on this question of governance and accountability, that how can accountability be navigated, and what kinds of structures can help maintain this accountability?
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, I want to delve a bit deeper from just the kind of co-funding arrangement. Certainly in the think tank initiative and in many other co-funding arrangements that IDRC has been involved in more recently, having multiple funders and having a good governance structure to how to maintain that accountability within the co-funding arrangement has been critical. And so, I mean, there's very sort of structural, very practical structural ways that you can do it with executive committees and representation from each of the donor agencies at the table. But then in terms of who's actually implementing the program, having a more operational kind of initiative management team with representation again at that executive committee of funders. I guess the think tank initiative really, I must admit, like in hindsight, I don't think our governance was very inclusive. It was in the kind of early days of these types of co-funding arrangements. And so I think we overcame a lot of the accountability and governance within the donor collective. But in terms of really coming back to the earlier point about having the other actors in the system at the table for decision making, I definitely think that there was a lot left that could have been improved. And as new co-funding arrangements, I think that, for example, the Science Granting Initiative, Council Initiative, I think they're much better in terms of having panels of advisors, as well as their more kind of formal executive committee and council committees. But they also have a way of really involving like the national research funders and the constituents that they serve as well. And so I think there's a lot of room for improvement here. I think governance structures and finding sort of common due diligence and overcoming that cost piece around like the administrative costs and finding efficiencies there, I think that really has a lot to do with the governance model. But I think there's still a lot more room to ensure that at those decision-making tables, you actually are inclusive of the different actors in the system. And I loved Andrea's point about like the difference between a vaccine and even the cartel. I hadn't thought of that, but sometimes, you know, there are funders out there in the vaccine space that I think have become a bit cartelish in terms of the power that they wield in really influencing that agenda. But I think having more representation within the governance of these co-funding is really the way of the future. And I think we're getting there, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. To that point, coming to the localization point, though, when it does come to governance, and Andrea, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. I mean, having worked with think tanks for almost a decade, what we realized is that at the national and more local level, this whole the power asymmetries within a national research ecosystem are quite diverse and quite stratified, and there's a huge spectrum. And so oftentimes, even how do you ensure representative voice at the table, even at a national level or local level, when we know from our experience supporting think tanks that oftentimes we were criticized because of the elitism and how the whole sector of think tanks is perceived as quite an elite space. If you talk to civil society organizations or farmer cooperatives or other groups in the country, in the local context, they would say, well, that they don't, their reality isn't our reality. So how can they represent our voices? So I guess that's a whole level of governance and accountability to who and whose voice matters, that I think there's still a long way to go in terms of how we really, as funders, set these co-funding arrangements up so that we are building equity into the whole DNA, the whole design of what the interventions that we're aiming to contribute to.
Thank you for being so honest, Julie. So I don't think it's very often that from a funder, especially that you hear them talk about so much honesty, especially about things that did not work well. And I really like that how both of you are talking about common themes like power imbalance and just the fact that there is so much power that funders can often have, even if they don't realize it. Andrea, as you mentioned, that what to them may not be a huge amount at the local level, it might actually be a very big and significant amount. And just the fact that there's so much power, and as Andrea, you pointed out that there is almost a chance of cartelization. And I'm sure that you have been at the receiving end of the problems that some of these governance mechanisms or lack of governance mechanisms can bring up. So what is your opinion on this? That how can these issues of power asymmetry and potential lack of representation and lack of voices being represented from your experiences, how do you think that these can be addressed? And also, I would love to hear your take on how all of these play out in the context of governance structures.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. So I think that the topic of accountability has been really central in the discussion around aid for a really long time. And I think there's opportunity to learn for philanthropists also from that space. Because at some point when in the history of aid, there was the discussion that there was no, aid was not having an impact. One of the ingredients of success was identified was mutual accountability, is how they framed it in the effectiveness of aid discussions. And the idea was that there is a mutual accountability between the recipients and the funders. But the reality is that all the organizations in the system have like competing accountability lines. And I think it's important to acknowledge those first and kind of like be clear about them. Because, for example, it makes no sense to talk about mutual accountability, or if it's among funders, is joint accountability, without really being clear about who each one is accountable, right? Like the POs are accountable to someone else in that management team, and there's the board oversight. So I think before trying to do any sort of like joint accountability or so on, it's important to be very clear about what are the existing lines of accountability, and working from there, instead of like trying to build something that may look perfect, but it doesn't work in reality because there are these other conflicting accountability lines. So I think that's one point that I wanted to make in terms of the practical sense of accountability. But from, I think, building on some of the things that Julie was highlighting of how to include the members, the actors that are implementing and that are actually carrying out the activities to promote change. I think it's really important to be careful with how things are framed in light of accountability, right? So, for example, one of the ways that is usually used in these co-funding arrangements, and particularly because there is a need for accountability and transparency from the competing lines of the different donors, is, for example, to have open calls and have these processes that are usually used in research funding. But we need to think of whether these are actually the best approaches, taking on the lens of localizing, as Julie was saying, because with those mechanisms, for example, they may seem very transparent and very competitive and, ensuring value for money, but it's more likely that we would select the same organizations that are equipped to fill in those processes and compete in that way. There is also the challenge that you may limit the actual possibility of actors to work together if they are competing for funding, right? So are there other mechanisms where one could develop the joint agenda and then fund from there diversity of actors and so on? So I think those are important considerations to take as well. And I think from a recipient perspective, and I've talked to a lot of researchers over the past years about the funding practices, the main concern is the accountability around who is deciding the agenda. And many times researchers in the ground feel like they are fulfilling a research agenda that someone just woke up one day and said, this sounds like a good idea, not necessarily that it responds to the needs of that place or so on. So I think an important ingredient of accountability, if we want to be accountable to the beneficiaries, to the people that we want to serve, is how are we coming up with the agendas that are guiding the funding program. And that's probably the biggest gap that we still have.
Thanks, Andrea. And it's interesting that from what I hear, that you are saying that accountability almost has to be embedded in the entire process. And it's not just about having a board or a mechanism or some sort of a process, but it's about embedding it from the very beginning, right? And even when it comes to setting the research agenda. And this is also, again, something that we talk a lot about, even within the AERFC, that research agendas need to be co-set. They need to respond to local realities. Local voices have to be involved even in the setting of the research agenda. And if I may ask you a follow-up question here, Andrea. So from what I heard from you, that you spoke a bit about lines of accountability. So is that also something as a recipient that you feel that that's very much a part of the accountability process, that even you being as a recipient being accountable for and demonstrating some sort of an impact, again another word that we love to throw around in this space. So is that something that you see as a part of the responsibilities of the recipient?
Yeah, well, I think that most of the time recipients of funding in this space try to navigate sort of like fulfilling the right level of things with the funder, so that there are no legal challenges or formal challenges to the work being done, but creating enough space to actually do the work that you think needs to be done, right? So managing that tension between acknowledging that there are requirements from a donor perspective and finding within those that flexibility. And maybe usually very productive funder grantee relationships are those that acknowledge that, right? That you both are sort of like needing to manage expectations and fulfilling formal requirements, but within those trying to find the space to adapt and to respond to needs, to change as the process goes on, and so on. So I think that is sort of like the balancing act that the recipients try to balance, because they have those multiple lines of accountability, right? Like you are accountable to the funder that gives you money, but you're accountable to the policymaker that is expecting something from you, or the community that is expecting something from you. So you need to navigate those as well.
Yeah, that is a very interesting. I had not thought of that, so that is very interesting to me personally. Before we move on to the second part, I'll just pause here for any questions. And Busayomi, Rachel, I would also, if you have any questions that you would want to direct to the panel, so I'll just pause for that. Julie, yes, please.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on this last point, I just wanted to actually share a very concrete example of how in the think tank initiative, we sometimes overlooked the knock-on accountability. Like we were so focused on our own accountability that we sometimes inadvertently, right, undermined the very think tanks accountability lines. And I'll give you a concrete example because it comes back to this obsession with measurement and impact. And so in the think tank initiative, there was one funder in particular who will go unnamed, who was obsessed with impact, and they wanted to see the results of the impact of the funding that they were providing. And just to remind everyone, the think tank initiative was actually core support, so not something we see a lot of, sadly, today. So it was very hard it wasn't funding for a specific research project on a specific theme in a specific time frame. It was flexible core support, and yet still this one funder wanted to see the impact. And so they basically said, we want you guys to test out this return on investment methodology, where you're going to actually trace the dollars that we've invested to this think tank in Peru. And you're going to tell me how that money actually played out and what the cost benefit analysis was of that funding for this particular infrastructure project that affected, multiple communities over a very long period of time. And so we hired this firm to do this ROI, test out this methodology. It was experimental, and we said it was experimental. But even still, at the end, they came up with these 2-page briefs. They were stories of impact, and they quantified the contribution that the think tank initiative had made to these think tanks. Well, that completely undermined the very relationships that this think tank had spent years building with local communities, with the policymakers at the municipal, level, at the local level, because there were so many other actors that were contributing to get that. Yet we put all this pressure on them to quantify what our contribution was, and therefore their contribution to that change. And it was like this aha moment when we had this major pushback saying, you can't put that on the website. We will never use that. That will destroy the relationships that we've worked so hard to establish. And so for me, that was a very kind of stark moment where this obsession with accountability and impact amongst a group of funders could so adversely undermine the very people that we were working so hard, we thought, to try to support.
Thank you, Julie. I think that ties together the discussion beautifully, that when you're talking about accountability, that also be mindful of the knockoff accountability lines. And also there are so many other actors and so many other factors at play, as you said. So thank you for rounding that off. So I'll now move on to this, I think, a very practical part of the discussion, that if you were to talk about some models of co-funding that have worked well in practice. And also, and we did make some references to this, that sometimes there could be alternative approaches to co-funding that might work better, either because there are too many disparate voices, or just as you said, that co-funding a vaccine is not the same as co-funding a systems change initiative. So what could be some alternative approaches that could be useful, and maybe what are some situations where they make sense? So so Julie, if I may start off with you, so maybe some examples of models that have worked well, and what could be some potentially alternative approaches which may work better in certain situations.
Yeah, I wanted to share two more current examples. So the first one actually speaks about to an alternative approach. So right now, the whole AI landscape, of course, as we know, is completely kind of blowing up, and there's so many different focus areas. And this is actually an alternative model. So this is parallel funding, but this is a funders collaborative where it engages the private sector, it engages lots of a range of philanthropy, different donors, different governments at all levels, to basically have an agenda for action around improving the AI, the inclusiveness of AI for D, everything from governance to privacy issues to everything. It's sort of a catch-all, but it sets an agenda and it uses parallel funding, because we all know as funders, IDRC loves co-funding because we actually get the funding, and we're both a donor as well as an implementer. So it's part of our operational model to actually seek out partnerships where we are co-funders, but it doesn't work in every instance, and it's not the right modality in all instances. So in this example, IDRC still plays a quite central convening role and secretariat role for this AI for D funders collaborative, but it allows funders who may not be able, not every funder can grant to another funder, right? It's almost like a re-granting mechanism, what a lot of times co-funding looks like, especially if you're going through an implementing agency. Oftentimes IDRC plays both a donor and an implementing agency role. In this case, they're able to actually have quite a few private sector investors on board. They're able to attract more of a broad diversity of funders towards this common goal, and they convene regular meetings. Even though everyone's funding directly different interventions, it still has this sort of structural goal of trying to set an agenda and move it forward, hopefully also in a more inclusive way than some of the past examples. But this is an interesting model as well, and it overcomes some limitations to being able to actually crowd in more diversity of different types of funders with different types of amounts. The other platform that I've found quite interesting, and I actually haven't yet seen an evaluation on, is the co-impact model. So in that case, I mean, to Andrea's point around costs, they have set up a whole platform. Co-impact is actually an organization that is the implementer. So they're not a donor per se, but they basically pool capital and have a broad agenda around education, health, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with co-impact, but it's also another model of, it's more co-funding, but it's setting up an organization that pools funding and is able to actually set up a platform around this common agenda. So I think these are two alternative models to actually co-funding in the way that the Think Tank Initiative or the Science Granting Council Initiative are set up, whereby there's a group of funders who come together to design an intervention with a theory of change and then fundraise towards that and find that common objective, bring others along who have those common objectives towards that agenda setting. So I guess the question will be is, when evaluations come out of some of these other alternative ways, are they more inclusive about bringing better representation and voice in the overall design? Because I really think that's the elephant in the room. That's the biggest nut we still need to crack. I think we need to find the model that best serves the interests and represents the voices of those actors in the research ecosystems that we are aiming to serve.
Thank you, Julie. We also have two questions for you, and they are kind of related. So Rachel asks that while we acknowledge that impact can never be attributed to a single actor, how do we still show impact to funders who might want some quantitative metrics? And then Busayumi, again, related question, as I said, that in terms of maintaining a balance between a funder's ROI and capacity of what grantees can even achieve, right? So how do we manage these expectations? I guess the question is that how do we balance these varying interests, that it is, while it is not possible to attribute impact to a single actor, but still metrics may sometimes be called for in certain occasions or for certain purposes. And then there's also the question of maintaining a balance between these competing interests. So how do we balance this? And also Andrea also raised the point of that accountability should not impede and on the grantee's relationship with the community. So if you were to balance all of these interests, how do we go about doing that? And Julie, maybe you can go first, and Andrea, feel free to also step in if you have an opinion on this.
I mean, I think your point around the return on investment, I'm not sure in the research for development space whether going forward those types of impact stories are fit for purpose at all, quite frankly. I mean, I haven't seen that tested again. And I just feel like if you're a vaccine, if you're a funder that supports particular health interventions, there are moments where I think it can be done and serve, not be detrimental, and can be done in a way. But in the research to policy space, I just feel like stories of change or most significant change or more qualitative methodologies for capturing that sort of arc of contribution towards a change are much more appropriate. And I think funders, by and large, are recognizing that, you know, they can't make demands for ROI type impact. I would shy away from, if I had funders like that and I was trying to set up a co-funding arrangement, I would be very weary about engaging in those kinds of conversations.
Thank you, Julie. And Andrea, I guess that maybe, you know, that leads me to my question to you, that do you see this playing out as a recipient? That do you still see that demand for these sort of metrics and impact stories? And just with that context, if I just go back to the framing question, that what are some models that have worked? And often, as we said, that these approaches, maybe we need to rethink these approaches, right? So maybe if you can comment on that, that do you find that there is a change? And if yes, if not, what can be done differently in terms of just rethinking these questions of whatever comes with co-funding, that these metrics and return on investment and impact stories? I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think you know, making the similarity with the risk, right? There is this sense, and we've had certain discussions around this topic with donors and grantees as well, that risk is something that drives a lot of funders, and it ends up being that you end up pushing all the risk to the recipient, right? And then it kind of works on the other way around. Once there's success, then you want to take all the success because you put in the investment, right? So I think what we need to start thinking about is more of a broader value chain of for the monitoring and evaluation of these endeavors. So when you think about it right now, usually the monitoring and evaluation is again targeted to the grantee and targeted to they've received the money, what have they done, right? And there has not been any sort of like M&E of or reflection, learning, and so on of the previous part. How was the funding given? How was the agenda set up for that program? So it needs to start, you know, I think that this whole concept of learning, measuring, and so on needs to start earlier on in the process. That it starts with setting the agenda for the program, how that was set up, then how were the funds distributed, why were they distributed as programs and not as core funding, you know, all these things. And maybe these may enable funders slowly finding a way about talking about their success and their value without putting so much pressure on the final outcome of the grantees, right? Because there's so many things that can go wrong between giving the money and the final impact, right? But maybe there are ways in which funders can start talking about their role and kind of like their own contribution in a better way, that it's not about putting all the pressure on impact on the final grantee. So I think that sort of like change in our way of thinking may be helpful, because we are still putting all the pressure on success on the grantees, and that may not be sort of like the best approach, and it doesn't lead to learning and on growth on the funder side, because there's many things that can be learned in that space, right? About how the agenda is set, how the program is set up, how the collaboration happens, and that's usually never found in the M&Es, because it's sort of like thought of like, okay, we're the funders, let's think about what the others are doing, not about what we are sort of doing. So maybe that would be my way of looking at this question.
Thank you, Andrea. And I really appreciate how there's so much common ground between you and Julie, and we all seem to agree on the broad first principles almost, right? So from what you said, and we also plan to turn the this conversation into sort of a guiding concept note. And I'm just getting very excited thinking about, because what we're really getting are very strong guiding first principles, right? About how to think about funding mechanisms and how to think about impact and how to think about measuring and how to think about sharing accountability. So this is all very useful. With that, I will move on to the last part of the discussion. And I just want to just do a quick time check. We have around 8 minutes left, but this is very important. And I'm sure that both of you will have opinions on this, that of course, we all know about the current global landscape when it comes to funding. So how do you find that some of this is changing the appetites and expectations around co-fundings? And what lessons can we draw? And you have already spoken, both of you have spoken to this, that what lessons can we draw, which are especially useful in the current climate that we are in? So yeah, that's my last question to both of you. Julie, maybe you can.
Andrea, do you
go
want to
first.
go first for this one? I've been somehow
Yeah,
speaking first.
Okay, sure. Well, it's a very tricky time for the sector. I think that my main the positive side that I see of it is that the current gaps in leadership in the multilateral sector does open up the possibility of maybe actors in the global south, the ones that are kind of like doing the change, to try to drive some agendas into setting up the priorities of actions, right? Because when there's a void, that becomes a possibility, right? When there is less interest in this space from the big donors. I think that it is a gap. I don't think that this is multilateralism is going to die completely. It will come back later on. But the question is, can we use this opportunity, this gap, to strengthen the position of the actors in the global south? So could we have more shared agendas, like shared problems that we're tackling, that we try to position from our regions of the world? For example, I don't know, in Latin America, the whole issues, all the ramifications of security concerns are totally under-researched and under-analyzed. But maybe this is an opportunity to try to position these new agendas. And then pragmatically, I think that maybe it's an opportunity for funders to also see other organizations that are more at the regional or national level as playing that intermediary implementation role than we have usually seen. Probably it could be argued that it could be more cost effective and so on, and maybe those sorts of narratives may become relevant in this junction in the process. But again, I come back to the importance of the agenda setting and just trying to see if whether these gaps open an opportunity for doing agenda setting differently, which is very hard when you have, USAID with so much money coming in and setting the agenda. It's hard to counterbalance that. But when there is a void, maybe those are opportunities to change that a bit.
Thank you, Andrea. And Julie, maybe you can take a couple of minutes just to some of your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously at IDRC, we're thinking quite intensely about this exact question, right? We're in a time where I think the whole sector is walking cautiously on eggshells every day around resources and cuts we keep hearing about, no matter what country or context you're operating in. But it's definitely a space where, as Andrea said, like there's an opportunity for leadership right now. And at IDRC, we're really thinking with our leadership team about how we can step boldly into this space while not potentially sacrificing or undermining those accountability lines that we have. And so just a few thoughts they represent more my personal perspectives rather than IDRC as an organization, is that obviously in this time, funders like IDRC need to work with others to really rethink how we're supporting research without bringing down the whole house, right? That's the tension. It's like in a time like this, we could just deconstruct all of our systems and structures and policies and practices about how we've done grant making. But then where does that leave us? I don't think it leaves us or any of the communities or partners in different parts of the world any further ahead if all of a sudden we go too boldly. And so I think it is about finding like-minded funders who are willing to take some risks, and maybe it's about diversifying risks. I don't think IDRC or any other funders are going to entirely turn up their apple cart. I know we looked to the global philanthropy space after USAID shut down and thought they're going to step into this space. They're going to fill the void. But there's a fear there and an accountability there that is holding them back as well. And so I think from my personal perspective, there's an opportunity to work with other funders. And so IDRC is part of this International Research for Development Funders Forum with UK CDR. And I think these types of spaces are where everyone's talking about systems change, right? But it's like we can't do systems change with a group of funders who hold a lot of this purse strings using the same way that they've always done grant making. So we need to test and pilot a whole different approach. And I think that if there was a group of funders that were willing to pull off a discrete amount of funding to really experiment and step boldly into the space where we can have a governance that actually really brings in a diversity of voices, that actually listens to the agendas that are needed in these different contexts, that actually really turns the whole collaboration and grant making process kind of on its head, but in a lab setting, we can showcase what is possible with a bit of money. And so, I mean, I guess this is like a call to action. It's more of a personal kind of push that I'm making within IDRC, and there's certainly many others as well. But I think that this is a huge opportunity. But if we're talking about transforming the system, we can't transform the system with the same power imbalances, the same funding practices that we've always used. And I know there's a lot of people that are like, we'll just make incremental changes. We'll change our reporting so it's lighter. We'll be more flexible. We'll give longer timelines. But that's not going to be enough to really move the yardstick. So the question is, can we leap boldly, or can we take off bigger chunks of incrementalism collectively towards seeing that paradigm shift? I guess time will tell, but I'm hoping that some funders will come together to be able to at least want to create a lab experiment, go back to some core funding that really leaves the agenda setting entirely to the research recipients and lets that localized agenda really be owned and managed and driven without so much imposition by funders. But that's my sort of wish list for a context that's, of course, it's not going to be as straightforward as that.
Thank you, Julie. And I think that is a great call to action even for us as a group. As you said, that it's the right time to take bold measures. So USAID shut down virtually overnight, right? So there is no reason why like-minded people cannot come together and make bold leaps and make bold incremental leaps at the very least. So this is just the right time to, and I can see Busayomi hopefully nodding in agreement that this is the right time to really make some bold actions. And this conversation has given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the very rich and very honest, I think that really stood out for me, that a very honest discussion, and the willingness to just think beyond just the confines of models. And even though we framed our discussion as such, but just the willingness to just think more broadly and really give us a lot to work with and think about. So this has been a very useful and a very rich discussion. I thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise and your insights. And as I said, that we will convert this into a guiding note, which I am very excited thinking about, and we will share this with a broad group as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great week ahead.